Welcome to the Antifada, where unrest is best. I'm Jamie Peck.
I'm Sean KB.
And we are here with a special guest host today. Oh, wait, are you going to pretend to be Andy? I forget.
He doesn't have to.
I'm Andy Kindler. Hello.
Oh, shit.
Am I the only Jew in the Antifada? It's Andy Kindler.
Oh, we got the wrong Andy.
Not AP Andy, Andy Kindler.
Whoops. He must have just been looking for Sam or something. I know he's
Ricky
friends with Sam.
Gervais guy. Is that a comic? Is he even Jewish?
I don't think he is, Andy.
Now do your Judy Gold.
Trump is a fucking scumbag. He looks like somebody shit in a fucking bag and then filled it with tampons.
And Mike Pence is fucking gay. He's fucking gay, people, and Trump is fucking fat. All right? I can say that because I'm a dyke.
I like how we're all in the MR studio, so we're like tyrannized by all the characters on Majority Report.
Let's not say that too loud. Nation of Islam Obama might come to say hi, say something problematic that you can't get away with saying in your normal voice.
Well, I think Will should be able to sit in Matt Leck's seat because once you get in, this area, you're just immediately high on marijuana. I think that's how it works, right? Well, we are going to be talking about some real bong rip shit today. We've got an excellent interview lined up with, I think maybe my favorite science fiction author. Is it? I don't know about you guys. You might have another favorite.
He's neck and neck with Ursula Le Guin for me.
Will?
He's in the convo.
He's in the convo. Kim Stanley Robinson is his name. And,
Fwa, fwa, pew, 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 pew.
Pew, pew, pew. And we're going to be talking with him about how to integrate a sort of leftist futurism with literature that is interesting and fun and enjoyable and touches on all aspects of human life without being completely fucking boring like so much leftist literature is.
It's so good. I'm not even going to try to pretend that we didn't already do the interview because I think I'm still a little bit high on talking to one of my sci-fi heroes. How about you, Will?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you guys for letting me sit in on this one. I've been a huge admirer of Kim Stanley Robinson ever since I read his Mars Trilogy, and I've stayed with him. And he is he's a sci-fi writer, but he's also of the left. And his books, I think, most importantly, deal with a future, but like not just a future, but a post-capitalist future. And I think an important thing that's touched on in this interview that I like about his work, and I think is really important, and going against the grain of popular culture today, is that he is sort of against a kind of like dystopian or apocalyptic future, but one that still takes seriously, the catastrophes of politics or the environment or any of these things that can happen, but that doesn't just take for granted that we're all going to be, shitting in our hands and, eating dirt in the next 50 years, which, as he says in the interview, could happen, but it doesn't have to happen. And there's no, it's a failure of imagination on the part of our culture that all science fiction now and really every vision we have about the future is inherently apocalyptic. It's a kind of laziness in our imagination and our politics that I think he does a really good job of getting past.
Well, it's easy to feel sort of cynical and dystopian when you're so mired in what's happening right now in current events, right? Because things are pretty dark right now. And I think especially when you do a show that is like sort of hooked to the news cycle, like every single day, like I do at Majority Report, if that's all you see, then you do start to feel kind of doom and gloom as a leftist, right? Which is why it's so important to look to the future and not just like 2020, not just a few years down the line, but like the far-looking future and what's possible for humanity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, so much of what we do, and I mean we in the larger sense in the culture, or as individuals or people in the media, which I guess we are, is very short-term thinking, right? About how are we going to organize this campaign? How are we going to canvass? How are we going to get more members for our organization? What's the next, big social struggle that's coming up? And it is so easy to lose sight of, what happens not just 2 years, but 20 years and even 200 years is important because, as human beings, we're ultimately passing something down to generations, in the future. And what we do today has a huge effect on, how those people are going to be living and hopefully living because socialism or barbarism is more real now than I think it's ever been.
Oh, yeah.
With climate change and this reactionary wave that we're seeing right now. But I would say that science fiction has always been instrumental for me. Not to like pop psychologize myself, but maybe there's something about the fact that I'm really into history or I'm really into the future that says something about my idea of the present. Because ever since I was a kid, it was always either like history in the past or science fiction in the future.
Yeah, no, I think it's same here because I think honestly, especially in fiction, unless you're like an extremely talented like novelist, like a writer of the highest level, I think it's almost impossible to say anything meaningful about the present moment in fiction writing about it now.
Right.
Like, so to me, like writing about the past or writing about the future is to me like the most interesting way of talking about, our lived experience or the cultural moment that you're in without being, cloying or forgettable or just instantly disposable. Like, much art is, not that it's all bad, but it just sort of, you forget it. It's just you consume it and forget it. And I guess if you're not familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's books, I mean, the Mars Trilogy is sort of the entry for a lot of people. And in those three novels, he sort of creates a kind of history over several centuries of the human colonization and terraforming of Mars. And, through characters and through fiction, really describes a political, economic, and ecological process. And both the individual characters' political choices and inputs in that, and sort of a broader vision of humanity and ecology that is fascinating and I think really useful towards understanding, our present political moment.
Yeah.
Well, time is a flat circle. So if you think about it, really, the future is just history that hasn't happened yet from our current vantage point within the fourth dimension, which of course is time.
That is not the first bong rip thing that will be said during the course of this episode as we get deep into the spiritual and psychological and psychedelic aspects of Stan's worldview.
Oh,
and
we're
his
going
work.
deep.
We're going deep.
We're going all the way in.
I think the last thing I would say before we get into the interview is that I think, Will, you pointed towards this too. It's important too to kind of when we're talking about technology, we're talking about history, we're talking about these grand sweeping events, and we're talking about political change. It's so easy to lose the human, the actual relationships and the psychology and the importance of the individual and their relationships. And I think what Kim Stanley Robinson does excellently is he's able to write a series of novels, a trilogy that spans hundreds of years rather, and at the same time make it human. Because ultimately, if nothing human is alien to us, we need to always keep track of that and be aware of that moving forward. And things like the Mars Trilogy and his other works, I think, are really good at kind of squaring the circle between the meta and the individual.
Yeah, science nerd shit, but make it human.
Exactly.
Like I wasn't really, okay, so true story. Sean got me into sci-fi. I was kind of into sci-fi and fantasy when I was a kid, and then, grew up, and I'm like, oh, that's for nerds. But Sean, I don't know if he did this on purpose, but he...
No comment.
He gave me a little book to read called The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and it really got me thinking through some of these ideas about socialism, particularly more anarchist versions of socialism, in a way that I hadn't before, and probably wouldn't if it was not also a book with lots of, relationships, love, and sex and fun stuff too. It's like it's all part of the same delicious yin yang messy whole. And I think he does a very so to speak, I think he does a very good job bringing those things together in a way that really hits the back walls of your mind.
Indeed it does.
Well, this interview touched all the walls of my mind for sure.
The hallways of always, folks. That's where we're going right now.
And like, I think if people want a little intro to the way that he envisions utopia. Maybe you don't have time to read a whole book right now, although you should read, all of his books, of course. Kim Stanley Robinson wrote a great article in Commune magazine about the role of utopia and the sort of lazy cynicism that people can fall into with dystopia. And I really like it because I think the utopia has been wrong. The utopian has been wrongfully painted as this naivete in politics, in culture, whatever. When this is something I think about a lot. He used the term asymptote in conversation and in the book to talk about human development in various ways. And that's kind of a big part of how I envision communism, right? Because full communism is obviously this utopian vision, right? People make memes about it. We're all just like
good memes,
floating orbs in space, just like doing butt stuff and having
that's literally in 2312, by the way.
Having a nice time.
Read the book, folks.
But maybe we won't ever get there. But there's a but. That doesn't mean we can't try, right? And if communism, or if what we conceive of, right, as our like democratic socialist society or whatever is striving ever closer to that delectable goal, maybe that's good enough.
Everybody on the forward march, not one step back towards full butt stuff communism.
And on that note, here is our interview with Kim Stanley Robinson. I hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed doing it. Boom.
All right, we are here with award-winning author, and science fiction hero of all of ours, Kim Stanley Robinson. Hi, Stan. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Sean. It's good to be there.
Jamie, I think, is going to start the round of questions. We are here with, of course, Will Menaker still.
Hello.
And yes, we're all extremely excited for this. So, Stan, Jamie is going to start throwing some curveballs at you. Just kidding. They're going to be softballs.
Okay.
Here's a gotcha question. Just kidding.
Okay.
It's a nice question. So about 2 years ago, I think I pitched and got assigned an interview with the sci-fi author Ursula Le Guin, who was very influential in my own life and my own political awakening, shall we say. But unfortunately, she passed away before I had a chance to speak with her. And I know you studied under her at UC San Diego, and I'm sorry for your loss as well as the world's loss. What can you tell us about Ursula Le Guin, about her influence on you, on your own work, and maybe the world in general?
Well, thank you for that. I love to talk about Ursula Le Guin. She was indeed my teacher, which is a remarkable coincidence that I treasure. I had gone to UC San Diego as an undergraduate, gone off to graduate school in Boston, freaked out at the winter time in Boston, and retreated to San Diego, where I took up graduate school there instead of in Boston. And I felt like an idiot after I got back to San Diego. But the right soon after I got back, UC San Diego's literature department announced they had gotten Le Guin to agree to come to teach for a spring quarter. And so then I thought, well, maybe it wasn't so stupid after all. And my going back to San Diego, it was, at that point I had sold several science fiction short stories. I was completely committed to being a science fiction writer. I'd been to Clarion. I'd been reading intensively for about, at that point, no more than 6 or 7 years, but very intense reading. And Le Guin had published in the same time that I had gotten into science fiction. Well, she had already published The Left Hand of Darkness, but while I was into it, she published Lathe of Heaven and The Dispossessed. And The Dispossessed was a mind-boggler that I had read about 2 years before she showed up at UCSD. And so she was, even then, the preeminent American science fiction writer. It was pretty clear to everybody, and especially if you're on the left.
I'm sorry, are those wind chimes in the background?
Yeah, is that bad?
It's kind of endearing, actually.
It's kind of charming.
I am. It's a windy day. I'm outdoors where I always work, and it's sunny. It's cold but sunny, and I can put the kibosh on the wind chimes if you want.
You know, we're recording in Brooklyn now, and we don't know where our listeners are in the world right now. They probably don't have access to wind chimes, and I don't think it's a problem. Let's just allow that ambient wind chime to go in the background. Let's just keep rolling with it.
Well, I could say also that I'm taking part in Cornell University's great bird count. And so today is the last day of a bird count where you count and name all the birds that you see. And so I'm out next to my bird feeder. And while we're talking, I'm keeping little tabulation on how many white-crowned sparrows show up.
Stan, can we get a count on how many birds you've seen today? Or any one in particular?
You sure the heck can. I have seen, I don't know if you want as much detail as I could give you, but, about...
Just the highlight reel.
Within reason,
the highlights. 2 yellow-billed magpies. They are absolutely only local to this part of the valley. Birders come from all over the world to see these yellow-billed magpies. Lots of crows, lots of Canada geese, lots of, I call them little beige birds because I'm not a real birder. A red-tailed hawk, a Swainson's hawk, a flicker, and a little bluebird that I've never seen before, so that the bird hunt seems to have called up for me, and a lot of goldfinches.
Perhaps it's evolutionary psychology and our desire to be surrounded by wilderness and nature, but I'm feeling a little bit jealous right now, I have to say. I've seen 0 birds today, unfortunately.
Same.
Yes. Brooklyn, I know Brooklyn a little bit, and I love Brooklyn, but it doesn't seem like a great birder spot.
There's the standard pigeon, but then, of course, sparrows and starlings are about the most common. Occasionally I do see a hawks in Brooklyn.
Right, they have a thing with the skyscraper setbacks. I go to if you go over to the river up at, is it Astoria, at Hellgate, there's some, I did a quite extensive exploration of Brooklyn and of the New York area for when I was writing my New York 2140. And my best friend in New York lives in Brooklyn and took me to places that I wouldn't have known to go to that got into the book. And I'm always looking for birds, although I have to say I'm not a good birder. I don't know what I'm seeing most of the time, but I've gotten really interested in them because of my work life here. Well, I always write in my front yard, and that's what Davis gives me.
Oh, yeah. We saw a picture of that in, I think, the article that Wired did on you, and it looks like a really delightful and lovely place to work.
It is. It's a little bit freakish what I've done. About 10 years of sitting in this chair where I'm sitting right now, looking at the bird feeder and at my gates and my fence and my Japanese maple. And I know what season it is because of the tilt of the sun over to my left, and on it goes like that. I see the sky, the clouds, the wind, and the trees right now. It's beautiful, and it has put many years onto my writing life that might not have happened because I was feeling so burned out 10 or 15 years ago when I moved out here and discovered that I wasn't burnt out on writing. I was burnt out on sitting indoors. I can sit outdoors all the time very happily, but not indoors.
That's amazing. Because I think that all of us here appreciate that, that burnout has passed. And thank you to Davis, California, for allowing you to make all the great novels that you've done. So you worked with Ursula Le Guin, and I think I saw somewhere, too, that the famous Marxist cultural critic, Frederick Jameson, was also part of your studies and your inspiration. So between Ursula Le Guin and Frederick Jameson and your other experiences in life, how did you become radicalized? How did you become an anti-capitalist, and how has that affected your work?
Yeah, I'm sorry I stopped you in the middle of talking about Ursula.
I think it's better to have an organic conversation, and it's good for me to kind of collect my thoughts as well. Jameson was crucial, and the third of the great writers that I was lucky enough to have as teachers, and I'm astonished at the luck involved with this. The third is Gary Snyder, the California poet. And you might call him a Buddhist eco-warrior, a leftist for sure, and a hero of mine since the same time that I was beginning to read science fiction. I was reading poetry and Zen, Buddhist texts. This is all very California hippie, 1972 type intellectual background. And I discovered the Sierra Nevada, and Fred Jameson was my first French professor beyond the conversational classes, the first literature classes. And he insisted on us all speaking French, which was a bizarre constraint because I only had about 100 words of French in me. And he assigned the short plays of Camus and of Sartre. And so we read those plays and we discussed them in French, and Fred was very patient with us, very slow in his speaking, and very clear, and also very existentialist, and I didn't realize it at the time, and very Marxist. So it was the 70s, the Vietnam War was still going, I had a draft number, I was radicalized by that, a very practical concern of not wanting to go to Vietnam and feeling like the war was a disaster and a crime. So it's very situational to my generation and the time that I came around. And I now think that that's true of everybody, that we're partly are just expressions of our historical periods, and the individual choices that we make are predicated on the opportunities of the time that you're in. And for me, the luck of running into Jameson, who is a very persuasive, very modest man, a bookish guy. He loves books and movies, and that's really the way that he likes to talk about things is through literature. But he's a very committed Marxist, and he was, I guess, what you would call the preeminent American Marxist critic, and especially in Western Marxism, trying to figure out what did it mean to be a Marxist after the Soviet Union and through the 70s and 80s. And so by reading him, he is my guide to everything else in the world of political theory. Sometimes he'll make suggestions and I'll read the people that he suggested to me and I'll understand them and it'll be wonderful. People like Ernst Bloch or Raymond Williams.
Oh, yeah.
And many other of the famous Western Marxists. Other times he'll recommend someone as being good to read, important, and I'll read them and I won't understand them at all. And it seems to me that Jameson's summary of them is better than their own original writing in terms of clarifying their thoughts. Indeed. And I don't need to specify who because I can barely remember. But what I can say is that he was my political teacher, and a lot of it was just reading him. He moved away from UC San Diego before I was even done with my PhD. He was directing it. It was on Philip K. Dick. I was in heaven. He moved to Yale. So luckily, my undergraduate advisor, Donald Wessling, really good teacher, very strong literature professor and a leftist, but not into science fiction at all. So Donald took over my PhD dissertation at that time. And Le Guin came when I was in graduate school early on. And Snyder, I was only a reader of, but he was the one that explained for me how nature fit into all this, that nature, culture, political/natural combination that I think is very important to me and to everybody. Snyder was the great teacher there for me, and I ran into him years later up here in Davis, where he taught at UC Davis through the 90s, and I got to know him, and we've become friends. I love Gary, and I probably know him the best of the three, although I've stayed in excellent contact with Fred, and I was in intermittent but warm contact with Ursula through the years.
Well, you sort of anticipated the question I was going to bring up to you. Speaking of being a product of a place in time, in this case, California in the 60s and 70s, and you writing your thesis on Philip K. Dick, I was just, really interested in, first of all, like what the thesis was about, and just, what reading Dick for the first time, like you responded to in his work.
Sure. I love Phil Dick and his work, although it's not my favorite. He's not my favorite writer by any means. And when Jameson said to me, and this is like 1972 or 3, he said, read Phil Dick, he's the greatest living American writer, bar none. And I went out and I bought Galactic Pot Healer, and I read Galactic Pot Healer, and I said, why would he say that? This is just a ridiculous, scrawny little short story, very Jungian, very spacey, very reality breakdown, very Philip K. Dick. And he said, read on. You got to read all of it. You got to read huge swaths of it. The individual books don't matter. It's the totality that matters, which, as usual with Fred, was a very smart way to go at it. And so then I read all of Dick under his direction, and I began to see what he was talking about. Dick is a tremendous novelist without being a great stylist. And the best of his books in terms of style is The Man in the High Castle.
Oh, yes.
But even there, Ursula has an introduction to Man in High Castle that is very funny, talking about how everybody, even the Germans, speak in Japanese English, which, as Ursula says in their introduction, must pause to consider.
Yeah, you mentioned Jameson saying that you have to read him, all of him, to get a kind of total effect, and his individual stories and novels do have kind of a shaggy dog quality, but when you read them like as an entire body of work, what do you think emerges for you?
Good question. I think the little man, the ordinary person as hero of the novel. So this was revolutionary in science fiction, where you had the kind of John W. Campbell Superman, the Nietzschean Ubermensch, the spaceship captain, Captain Kirk, blah, blah. And with Phil Dick, it's always the tire regroover, the vase repair person.
Right.
And so ordinary people. And then I also love the structure of his novels, which I've imitated many a time, which is you write from third-person limited point of view so that you're inside one character's mind, the narrator, speaking of them in third person, but reading their thoughts, and the other characters are outsiders. And then in the next scene, it's a different character looking back at the first character from inside the second character's mind. And this roving point of view is an extremely powerful tool for shaping novels and giving you a sense of three-dimensionality to the characterizations. So in technical terms, I think Dick, even though he was writing, on speed at 1,000 miles an hour, and several of his novels, like one year there were 5 novels, and there was a 5-year period where there were 13 novels, and this is the mid-'60s, and he would write them in 2 weeks, and so they're pretty slack and messy and rushed, but on the other hand, they're really powerful and strong. And so he's a mixed bag. And then also the political angle. He's, without being intensely theoretical about it, he's just instinctively anti-capitalist. His novels, and this is something Jameson taught me to see, they're all about the corrosive effects of capitalism on ordinary human relations, how it instrumentalizes everybody, and you turn into a calculator of value, even for other people. And so Dick's novels keep coming back to that. They're really about America in the 50s and 60s. And how
I always think of the in Ubik, where essentially everything is coin operated, like from your front door to your coffee machine. To everything in that book is about coins, and then of course the coin comes back in terms of telling you whether you're really alive or dead at one point in the book.
Yes, I just had occasion to do an introduction to Ubik. I reread it for the first time in about 40 years, and it's just a long short story. It's a mess, and yet that's exactly right what you pointed out. The fight that Joe Chip has with his door, a coin-operated door, to get out of his apartment, and trying to bargain about credit to get out of his apartment. I mean, it's AI, it's all the stuff that we're thinking about right now. And all done at this level. It's probably one of the greatest scenes he ever wrote, because it's very funny and it's very penetrating.
So more on these political aspects. We noticed reading your work in both the Mars Trilogy, which we've all consumed at least once in this room, but also
I cried several times while reading it. I just want you to know that.
Thank you.
In a good way, I'm sure she did. Not a bad way.
Yeah.
but also then in very much a different novel, which is Years of Rice and Salt, which is an alternative history. In both novels, in both universes, there are these specific moments where it seems like the kind of collective scientific knowledge and social awareness of human beings kind of combine together to create a sort of phase change in human affairs. It's almost like in both of these instances, whether it's the past or an imagined future, humanity is able to create something like historical materialism, something like ways of grasping the kind of interconnectedness of all the people and being able to overcome tyranny and division and want. This seems to be a theme in your work. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, about how people are situated and how we collectively understand the world?
Sure. It seems to me the basic problem or issue, it brings up just the question of history. And is it a story of us pulling our act together and making a better civilization, or is it just one set of power dynamics after another? And so it comes to a question of what is revolution? Can there be revolution anymore? Are revolutions more positive than negative when you consider the violence and the backlashes? And could there be a peaceful, somewhat organized revolution, what Raymond Williams calls the long revolution, or you might just say social democracy type reform from within the legal systems, instead of, if you did enough of those and did them smartly enough, could that constitute a revolution instead of the classic form of the French or the Russian or the American Revolution of armed revolt and violence and death, and then subsequent reactionary backlash, which especially in the French and Russian was obvious, and in the American one more subtle and strange. So I keep trying to write stories where that could be the topic, and it presents a problem for the novelist. It's a problem that historical novelists have had all along. And science fiction is kind of the flip side of the historical novel, in that you're trying to write both individual lives, characters that you care about, the kind of telepathy of being inside someone else's head. And the novel is really a bourgeois form. It's about the individual consciousness in a lot of ways, and then small groups. And then how does it encompass history? How do you include also history itself? Well, your characters have to go through something big. And so in both the Mars Trilogy and in Years of Rice and Salt, I invented ways of having individual humans that lived longer than we usually live.
Right.
The longevity treatment in the Mars Trilogy and reincarnation in the Years of Rice and Salt.
And the Bardo, that was fascinating, yeah.
Yes, and so this gave me a chance to talk about history explicitly and keep it at the level of characters. And in my other novels, where I've tried to deal with both these elements at once, but with ordinary human lifetimes, I've struggled to make it work. And the novel that I think is best called Green Earth, my Washington, D.C. trilogy, and in several other books, 2312, or the one that I'm working on now, I've been trying to continue to do that kind of project and write about moments of historical change that maybe they aren't revolutions, but they might be revolutionary in their ultimate impacts.
Speaking of your work, and I think sort of a contrast in my mind with your work and other forms of science fiction, it would seem to me that the dominant mode in science fiction, or really most of our popular culture right now, is overwhelmingly dystopian and apocalyptic, in that like everyone just sort of seems to assume that the Mad Max scenario is the future we're headed for. How do your books consciously go against that, like particularly, and why do you think that's important, particularly from a sort of leftist perspective?
Well, this brings me back to much that I have learned from Jameson. This is really kind of Jamesonian to say it's dialectical. Dystopia is the flip side of utopia. It's a political response, and it's therefore interesting. But he's also commented from time to time that we're weirdly comforted by dystopia, that it's a way of assuring contemporary readers that as bad as things are for us, it's not as bad as it's going to be for these poor characters in the future. And so you can read dystopias badly, or they can serve a bad function of just comforting you with kind of disaster porn that you read from a semi-comfortable spot in the precariat in this current year. But there's another way of reading it, and I know that Jameson would agree with this too, that it's an expression of how people are feeling, and novels are very important for that. How do young people feel today? Well, they feel scared, put upon, hopeless, and so dystopias have this immediate expression of a political feeling. So the political unconscious, as Jameson would call it, of dystopian texts is a sense of entrapment and despair, and so they're an honest feeling. But once you've expressed that feeling, you have to turn it over and think about the utopian view, that the reason that dystopias appeal to us is that there's a broad sense that things could be better, and that the future could be made to be better by what we do now. So this is, for me, I think dystopias are easy, and now it's a little complacent. It's become a kind of a cliche or a marketing category, and it's too easy. That, in fact, after there won't be Mad Max, although that's a kind of a worst case scenario, but it won't be an end. There will still be humans. This whole notion that it goes back to a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all is a reading of human nature that flies in the face of sociobiology itself. And we're actually incredibly social, incredibly altruistic and cooperative. And it may be that we're only altruistic within tight circles of family or group or kin, or even supposedly nation state or ethnic, although those are mostly concoctions. But we actually are team players. So what's interesting is to say, after a disaster, what does ordinary feel like for people who only know the post-apocalyptic state? And so that was what I was trying to write about in New York 2140. After the sea levels rise and there's a half century of utter disaster and chaos, then life goes on, and the young people of that time, that's all they know. They just think of it as normal. Oh, the past, there were disasters. Here we are in this new normality. And that's what dystopia misses out on. This notion that it's going to be a boot in your face forever is simplistic, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that, and I really like the way you put it in Blue Mars, too, when you write, it was a crisis which could have triggered a terminal disaster, a descent into chaos and barbarity, and instead it was being met head-on by the greatest efflorescence of civilization in history, a new renaissance. And I feel like that's a theme in a lot of your work, which is both like sort of catastrophist, because, you know, bad things happen and bad things probably are going to happen in real life, but also very optimistic in that, you know, human nature, it's a very difficult thing to define, but it definitely contains at least the possibility for a kind of pulling together that we see already, you know, amid disasters or what have you, and people help each other out. It's cool to think about, especially because I have to deal with people on a day-to-day basis who think that, you know, I'm not being practical by being utopian or being ideological, and people whose horizon is like, I don't know, some kind of left liberalism are not being ideological. They're just being realistic about the possibilities of humanity, right?
Yes, there's what I call a fashionable cynicism, or it's also a self-protective in that I don't want to seem naive, I don't want to seem stupid. And so very often being labeled optimistic, which I often am, this is code for the poor guy, he's stupid. He doesn't get it how bad things really are. And, you know, maybe it's biochemical, maybe he's just fooled. But it's you put yourself out there in a risky position when you say things could be better, or that it actually is a remarkable achievement for nearly 8 billion people to be alive on this planet without everybody already killing each other, that it could be so much worse, that you have to keep a balanced view of it. And the balance is hard because you have to admit that we're on the edge of a mass extinction event that could be really devastating, that gets us to the true dystopia, even to the Mad Max moment of ultimate devastation. That's possible. And so with that kept in mind, it's so scary that when you say, well, but on the other hand, we also could have inclusive prosperity, as this new economics group has called it, which is not a bad name, especially if you include the whole biosphere in the inclusion, that's also possible. Well, since it is, you ought not to deny that either. And what you come to is a completely bizarre moment, which maybe every moment in human history has been the same, but it feels more bizarre now. I don't know why. That we could, from the moment we're in right in this moment, it could be a terrible human future and biosphere future, or it could be a pretty great human future and biosphere future. Both are equally physically possible. And so then the political work becomes to try to shove it towards the good future. And on the most fundamental level, just to dodge the bad future.
So
yeah.
We're back to the socialism or barbarism.
Well, yeah, I think
100 years back. Right?
This moment,
Yes.
it's becoming more and more clear because we have this historically unprecedented pressure of climate change. And, even people who used to pretend that it wasn't happening aren't pretending that anymore. But you still hear people say things like, we could have a Green New Deal and try to stave off climate disaster and save the human race from dying out, but it might be too expensive, so maybe not. What's up with that?
It's the attacks on the Green New Deal have been revealing how shoddy and insufficient that ideology is at this point. The old style Republican capitalist business as usual that is leading us to the mass extinction event just looks bad. There is even old-time right-wingers who are used to sounding plausible with 50 years experience like George Will, their attacks on the Green New Deal are entirely empty of substance. And usually they toss the word. They say, but that's socialism, as if that is a QED on why it can't be done at all. And one thing that Jameson pointed out quite recently in a lecture at Duke, which I'm listening in on as if it's a podcast, is that in the previous moments of American leftism that have been prominent and then crushed, this is after World War I, and then after World War II, and then the third one would be in the 60s, they all had a moment of efflorescence and appeal, and then they all got crushed by political reversals and by a deliberate suppression. But none of them ever dared to say the word socialism in America, mostly after World War I. But this is Jameson's point, is that the idea would be that the socialist cause in the United States would do the good things without telling the general American public what they were in a kind of an avant-gardism. And then after the fact, after we were in a better state, say, oh, by the way, that's actually socialism, which was a silly way to go about it, because the American populace isn't that easily fooled, and we are the American populace. And so what's different this time, he pointed out, is that people are unabashedly using the word socialism and claiming that it's okay to say that word and still be in the American political mainstream discourse. It's a new moment, and I myself am stunned because I've been paying attention to the situation ever since those early 70s moments, and this is a kind of a first and a new horizon. And it might be a sign, I think it's true what you said, Jamie, that climate change is shoving this onto us. It's a kind of an enormous pressure that is forcing us to reconsider the way that we think about politics.
Yeah, totally. I think it's especially salient for young people, right, who look at, some older, more conservative voters who are probably going to die of old age and say, hey, I could die of climate change if we don't do something about this. So what's up?
Yeah.
Well, they might not die of old age if we get that life expansion pack described in the Mars Trilogy. Then we're going to be dealing with these people forever. But
I am really in favor of longevity treatments at my age, but I can tell you from my perspective, it's not going to come fast enough, and it looks to be way harder than people thought back even in the 90s. There's an asymptotic kind of resistance involved of physics and the difficulties of biology. Well, so no, I think people, in fact, average lifetimes are going down because our health habits are so poor. So I think we're stuck with what we've got, and I think that young people do need to grab hold of the political discourse as fast as they can and to reject the ordinary business capitalism, which is so amazingly destructive. And now that everybody's in the precariat, that there is no middle class, that if you're not in the 1%, you have reason to be scared. It's that impetus. You know, the reason there was a leftism in the 70s that I was part of as a young person was the Vietnam War. There's a physical, practical danger to your life that forces your politics. It's very materialist. And now the same kind of thing is happening with the precariousness of the gig economy, which is really just more exploitation.
Yeah, Stan, you mentioned the gerontological treatment perhaps not being on the horizon, the immediate horizon, but there is a group out in Silicon Valley, the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musks of the world, who want to have that, who want to be immortal to the extent that they are taking young people's blood and, putting all sorts of money into research to extend the billionaires' lives at the rest of us. It touches, that vision of the world, I think, touches on this kind of duality between dystopia and utopia you were talking about, because a lot of the thinking around technology and science and the future is pretty dark right now, especially coming out of Silicon Valley. There are the fears of this sort of AI singularity. There are these ideologies of neo-reactionism and the Dark Enlightenment, or some sort of fascist accelerationism.
The Endarkenment, as I like to call it.
Yeah. And these seem to be percolating, in the same sort of way that you were talking about as a response to social and technological change. Do you think that this is a science being divorced too much from the humanities? Is it an educational problem, or have we just not either faced the problem correctly, or are we letting the left letting futurism be taken over by people whose interests are not our own?
There's the future is a contested space, like government is a contested space, and like science is a contested space. So they're all battlefields, ideological battlefields. Discursive struggle is everywhere now. The Silicon Valley, I have a lot of contacts down there, being one of the great space cadets of our time, and an aging white male science fiction writer gets invited to a lot of these things to speak. So I take advantage of that, and I've met a lot of these people. And the Elon Musk is an interesting guy. Peter Thiel is not an interesting guy. And there's a lot of fantasy going on. And all of these people, the billionaires, of which I've met maybe a dozen now, they're all going to die in their 80s. And none of this... there's a fantasy response, which is essentially a bad science fiction response. And it's not confined to one political group. Everybody would like to be immortal or live longer, and they're not going to. And so you can either admit that and persist with what lifetime you're given and accept that we're mortal creatures, or else you can go into fantasy lands and talk about uploading yourself into an AI. And all of the AI people who are actually working on it down at Google and elsewhere in Silicon Valley will freely admit that AI is just a fundraising phrase. There's nothing to it. It's just, there isn't even machine learning to speak of, and the opportunities there to help humanity are substantial in terms of crunching big data and doing the things that computers can do, but it's not at all transcendent or transformative. And we probably won't even have self-driving cars. So you've got to understand that most talk now about technological innovation. It has to do with fundraising. There's an awful lot of venture capital out there. After the quantitative easing and the 2008 crash, $15 trillion were created and given to the banks, who then gave it to the rich. 90% of that money went to the 1%, and then it's trickle-down theory all over again. What it means is there's more investment money than there are good investment possibilities if you're trying to have a broad portfolio of future tech possibilities. So a lot of bullshit is getting thrown around, and a lot of money is getting invested in things that are going to be shown somewhere between 5 and 20 years later to be complete bullshit. So that's just what Silicon Valley is. And you don't want to get too distracted by that as a young leftist thinking about how do we change the whole political/economic system. Silicon Valley is kind of like a distraction, like Hollywood or something. It's not the real story. The real story is probably in Washington, or it's out in your garden. It's regenerative agriculture, or it's some kind of a Green New Deal support system. And I actually think that the billionaires are there's two things you could do. You could say more and more often, there shouldn't be any such thing as a billionaire. The tax structure should cut billionaires off. You should be able to make about $10 million a year, and beyond that, the tax rate rises to nearly 100%, and it goes back to the people who generated it, the American society.
Amen.
So strong progressive taxation, great. And I don't even think that needs to be called socialist, although it's a way of tweaking us towards more leftist values for sure. But you can remind people that during the Eisenhower era, that Dwight Eisenhower presided over a 91% top income tax rate, and that was when people hit $400,000, which these days would be about $4 million. So you could even say, let's just do like Eisenhower did, which I find very funny.
To return to your own work and some of the interesting contrasts that it makes with other more popular or other forms of science fiction in our popular culture. Usually in science fiction, the author takes a piece of technology or a social trend that exists in the present and projects it into the future to, spaceships, robots, computers, et cetera. And you imagine that evolution into society, in our society, like into the future. But in your work, you do, of course, do that with technology, but you do the same thing for economic systems and social relationships. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, like, how do you approach that process of imaginative speculation as it applies to, let's say, capitalism? Is it different than the same than of just imagining what computers will be like in 100 years?
It's a little the same, and thanks for this question, because it gets right to the heart of where I'm working and worrying. And I'm going to talk to you whilst I move inside, because there's somebody next door with power tools.
First the wind chimes and then the power tools.
The bane of my outdoor existence here is how frequently power tools are employed in a neighborhood context. But
it's throwing off the bird count.
Oh, that's right. I should be out here. Damn it. Can you hear the power tools?
I can't hear them.
No, I can't hear them. But if they're bothering you, then by all means.
Here.
Okay.
No, then let me get back to the point.
Yeah, sure.
What I've found is that what I usually do is try to get help from scientists. And so in terms of technology, like how do we get to Mars? What do we do when we get to Mars? Scientists, planetologists, they're lovely helpers, and they're willing to talk. When I think of what's post-capitalism, what's the next political economy that we're going to live under, the help is remarkably sparse. The written political economy of the last 50 years is, I could practically name them on one hand, and they're great. Herman Daly and Bookchin and Hazel Henderson and Fritjof Capra, and there's a variety, but they're kind of off the cutting edge at this point, and at no point did they give me much help. So when I was writing my novels, especially the Mars books, I was scrambling, and Mondragon, Spain has been a perpetual comfort to me as a functioning town that is nothing but co-ops, as a transitional state.
I'm sorry, we can definitely hear the power tools now.
They must have just turned them
You
up.
know what? The birds it drives the birds away too, so it's kind of a doubling here.
Okay. Why don't you?
I'm going to keep talking while I move, as
Okay,
long
great.
as it doesn't bother you. I'm headed in.
All right, sounds good.
So I do my research. I try to find what examples there are around the world of strong leftist communities. I think hard about what happened in the whole Soviet experiment. I really tried hard to understand China, and I have to admit, China's not easy to understand.
Red Moon. You did struggle with that.
I definitely did.
But it came out great at the end. I'm sorry. Go on.
No, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's my most recent effort, that and the New York novel. I'm trying to imagine what would come next. Well, maybe nobody at this point can imagine that very well. And even using the word socialist, as much as I am willing to call myself that, and I just love it that there's a Democratic Socialist of America doing so well, I'm happy to join that. I still think...
Oh, hell yeah. I'm a part of the Democratic Socialists of America, by the way. So
you both are.
Oh, heck yeah.
Well, you did join?
Right? Isn't everybody?
I mean, everybody should be.
Will, are you in the DSA?
I am a card-carrying member, but I don't go much further than that, unfortunately.
Yeah, me too. I pay my dues, and I read the things, and I try to help.
We'll take it.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is maybe what the political economy that's going to come if we get a good one in the 21st century, and maybe it'll need a new name. Maybe it won't look like the older socialist attempts. What I would love to have everybody doing is de-stranding the what you might call the toolkit, the defining characteristics of socialism, which ones are crucial and necessary, which ones are accidental and historical, and how do we apply them, the ones that are crucial and necessary, to the current moment that we're already in, because we don't get to have a fresh start. So these, I think, are the ongoing questions.
You brought up Mondragon, Spain, and and then previously when you were talking about Silicon Valley, like you talked about some of the great potential that technology could be used to aid humanity, and I wanted to ask you about in one of your novels, 2312, you talk about something called the Mondragon Accords, which is sort of could you describe that? It's like an economic system that has sort of replaced capitalism through the use of quantum computing to sort of create a centrally planned economy, that gets over the hump of the problems of having a centrally planned economy through quantum computing.
Yeah, sure. And that brings in all kinds of things, of course. But there was an old question that Francis Spufford's novel Red Plenty brings up the historical moment where the Soviet Union computer scientists were trying to invent a computer system that was strong enough to run a command economy without the market. And that failed because of corruption in the Soviet system and because it wasn't clear. Now we've got computers so immensely powerful, the things that they can do are amazing. And if you get quantum computers, even more so. And quantum computing is another big if, but it might happen. And even classical computers are enormously strong. Why couldn't we put into our economy what everybody needs, and then send out to the factories and to the fields, and then create what everybody needs, and then distribute it back out to what everybody needs without a market, since the prices in the market are systemically wrong, and the market systemically devalues people and the environment. So that's two big things that are being destroyed by underpricing of the market. And when you say the market system is a failure, well, this is completely terrifying, because we are in a global market system and we don't have an alternative. So in 2312, I was suggesting that in 300 years from now, we might have all these things worked out, and that trade would still exist. People would still make different things. They would still need to exchange the stuff that they make or that they do for the stuff that they don't have or that they want. So China has market socialism. Well, what does market socialism mean? And what are markets really? And these are questions that I'm trying to explore, where the responses, especially when you bring up the words markets, is extremely ideological. But on the other hand, that's not a bad thing. Everything is extremely ideological. It's just that markets are a huge force right now. They're one name for global capitalism, the market.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really object to when people treat the market as this like neutral, objective, almost naturally existing thing that is not heavily mediated by ideology and created by humans, ostensibly to serve humans, right?
Yeah, and it's a legal system. So the legal system could change, and you could have something that was, what would you call it? The post market, or the pseudo market, or the rationally contained and survivable market, or whatever. But when people say the market, like you say, that as if it's nature itself, well, this is a terrible category error. And I think part of the work of the left is to clarify that issue, that free markets are a legal regime that actually are not free for most of humanity suffers in the free market system.
Not to mention the ecology, right? Because like this is something that I often have trouble explaining to people who maybe aren't familiar with Marxist economics. The idea that we can solve the problem of climate change under the current political and economic formation of capitalism is it's a fantasy. It's at least as much a fantasy as building socialism within our lifetimes, right? Because if you believe in Marx's concept of value, the environment and the ecology around us, it has no value. It's just this infinite free gift that capital can use to extract value. And in that sense, I just cannot see us solving this problem while continuing capitalist accumulation on this planet, unless we expand to other planets, right? But that's like just kind of moving the problem around.
Well, but you can't expand to the other planets. That's definitive. So really, the problem has to be solved here. So yeah, capitalist accumulation is physically impossible at a certain point, and we've reached that point. What's interesting, though, is that, I would agree with you completely. And then what's the next? How do you alter markets in a rapid step? In other words, if you had 100 reforms in a row that you could write up as legislation and enact one law after the next to get from where we are now to a perpetual mobile of ecological circulation where humans fitted into this biosphere on this one and only planet, what would those 100 steps be? That's the interesting question. What? And I would say this right away, the proclamation of the Green New Deal is a fabulous start on this. It was an impressive document. It was nowhere near as content-free as I was fearing. And yet the 100 steps, the laws that you might introduce as bills in Congress, and then if you had a majority, you passed them. They became the law. People began to act according to these laws. What would those laws be?
It's interesting. Will mentioned the Madrigal collective that exists in the real world today, and you pushing that out into the future and imagining a way that could be a kind of overgrowth and an overcoming of capitalism. In Red Moon, your most recent work, you do the same thing with the technology of blockchain and cryptocurrency, which I found to be really fascinating because you tied it into the fundamental contradictions of capitalism we were speaking about, but also tied it to a way of accounting for ecology, when it comes to creating a socialism or something beyond capitalism. Blockchain and cryptocurrency is typically a right libertarian thing. Can you tell us a bit about how you came up with the idea of imagining a kind of financial revolution that was based on a new type of currency arrangement?
I can try, although I will immediately fall into the deep waters beyond my understanding. There are radical economists that are trying to create new cryptocurrency platforms that would be based on socially useful actions as the creation of value, so that carbon coin, solar coin, these exist, and blockchain is at the basis of all the cryptocurrency as a technology, but blockchain is also a way of distributing information that can't be altered after the fact amongst a large population. That's its very definition. So these things could be great populist socialist tools, and money itself, you create more money, like say in this quantitative easing after the 2008 crash, more money means more expenditure, means more exploitation of nature, means more running out of finite resources, means more climate change, more CO2 burned into the atmosphere. So money itself as a measure of value and as a generator of human energies, if there was a currency that was based on doing good things and the currency didn't exist without them, there is now a plan, and if you Google it, I hope the right papers will come out. It's called carbon quantitative easing, where the central banks of the world create new money, as they did after 2008, and they don't, instead of giving it to the banks, they create it and give it out based on how much carbon you have sequestered in a reliable certified blockchain manner. And so their carbon coin is like you save 100 tons of carbon, or you bury 100 tons of carbon, or somehow fix it to rocks, and then you've got one carbon coin, which would then trade on the currency exchanges with other forms of currency, like the franc, the dollar, etc. And if the carbon coin was supported by the central banks of the world with a 100-year bond, so that investors in the normal capitalist financialized world would say, well, we could fool around with the dollar renminbi exchange, or we could invest in carbon coins and know that we'll get a payoff on a regular basis. That, in other words, doing the right thing could compete financially with doing the wrong thing. Right. So if you Google carbon quantitative exchange, hopefully you'll get a paper called by a economist named Chen. I think it's D. Chen, Chen. And it's an interesting paper. It's getting some traction. It's getting some discussion. There's another new group called Economists for an Inclusive Prosperity, EFIP, and they're brand new, their announcement came out day before yesterday. Mainstream economists with a leftist bent or a desire for survivability, or a desire to make economics work again for the good of humanity. And that's a pretty big and vibrant group of mainstream economists. So in other words, the front is broad, but the problems are pretty clear that have to be solved. And I myself am just a storyteller. I'm trying to learn about this stuff, but what I really would love is for a lot of academic economists and whole economics departments to become political economy departments instead of economics departments, and to propose new changes.
That's such a good idea. I mean, we've talked a lot on this show about how economics, I think it was Richard Wolff who said that the function of economics departments right now in universities is primarily ideological. Yeah. Right?
Or it's like an old joke about how at every university, the economics department and business school are on completely different campuses, because they, one they teach you the bullshit, and the other one they teach you how to actually
how to be
really
the ruling class.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So this stuff is certainly ideological, these changes that we're talking about, but it's not unideological the way we do things now. And that's something I'm always trying to call people's attention to.
Well, I hope it's generally understood. I think things are getting contentious enough and dangerous enough that is more and more understood. Now that there is no such thing as news, now that there's no such thing as objectivity, I think it's really becoming understood. And that's a good understanding, because it was always true that everything was ideological. And now that everybody realizes that what you want is an ideology that explains the most and gives you the most positive ways forward. I didn't understand for a long time that economics economics doesn't mean anything but the quantitative analysis of capitalism, that economics is not in the business of doing political economy, that they're two different fields of human thought. And I was like most people, I think, in that I was thinking that economics and political economy were the same thing, but it's not true. Economics' job is just to analyze capitalism and then the currently existing set of laws and see what their effects are and maybe suggest some tweaks, but never basic and fundamental reforms. And then political economy is a 19th century thing that went away when capitalism basically took over the world. So you have political economy back in, you could be like Fourier, you could be like Proudhon, you could be like Marx and Engels. There was political economy. And now there's just economics. But I think political economy is coming back out of necessity.
I hope you're right.
Yeah, me too. So to switch gears a little bit, the sun's gone down. This is Antifada After Dark now. There are a lot of cool drugs in the Mars books, all of which seem to be legal in this utopian future society. There are also other pleasures like the bathhouses where young people go to get each other off and basically invent new ways to come. Are you trying to turn young people socialist by promising them sins of the flesh?
Well, that's a good idea. Maybe that was it all along.
That is the mindset.
One of the things about being a leftist, and I must say that a lot of this comes out of the 70s. The 70s were extremely radical in ways that are probably hard to I can barely remember them, and especially the feel of them. And for young people,
it shows you did it right.
Yeah, well done.
For young people like yourselves, the 70s is like what for me would have been the 1930s. You just can't recover times 40 years ago and capture how they really felt while you were living in them. So a lot of my writing comes out of a couple of core beliefs that pleasure is good, that Puritanism is bad, that fiction, and especially American popular fiction, was all about sex and violence, and I didn't want to write about violence, so I decided to compensate for that lack by writing more about sex. And
the bonobo way.
Yeah, try to be honest about it, and have some fun with it. And it's actually very hard to write about intelligently and with a sense of fun. And there's so many human activities that are hard to write down that there's no reason to pick on that one. But I think it's important to insist that a good life includes a sense of young people having a sense of the pursuit of happiness, of the potential, and that your 20s in particular ought to be a gigantic adventure and not a period of anxiety and dread. I mean, it's fairly simplistic on my part. I'm not a complicated thinker.
No, I totally agree. And it's especially salient looking at what's happening to young people right now, right? Like, kids are having fewer adventures. Basically, they're having less sex. Yeah. They're not experimenting with drugs. They don't even want to get their driver's licenses, which I find kind of alarming. And I think part of it has got to be that, their futures are looking more and more uncertain, that, their parents really want to protect them and just train them to be as productive as possible at all times.
Sure. And they themselves have to worry, will I have health insurance and a pension? Will I have a place to live? Can I make enough money to have a decent life, have adequacy? When these are worries, then you're going to see political change, I think. But I feel like, how can I say it? When the situation is as bad as it is now, then there should be a push, and I'm seeing the push. This is why you get the young people declaring that they're socialists. There's a rebellion against the trap that they see themselves in. And there are other things. I know. The other thing I wanted to mention is the internet and screens. That you all are the first generation to have grown up with screens, and it's easy, especially with the minds of young men, to get trapped into the screens as an alternative reality, and it's easier than a real reality. And you get a whole bunch of dopamine rewards, speaking of drugs, for small accomplishments in the games that you play and the interactions that you have. And in short, it's a virtual reality already that is replacing real reality in a bad way. And so some of these, like, I don't need a driver's license, I don't need to go outdoors, I still have a full life because I have World of Warcraft or whatever, something newer than that, I'm sure.
Fortnite, I believe.
Yeah. I'm going to resist the urge to call Sean out right now for all the nights he's ignored me while playing Fortnite.
Yeah, well, see, this is a category error, and what I want to suggest is there you are in Brooklyn, you're thinking, well, I'm in a city, what can I do about it? You can just walk down to the East River and sit there underneath, in Dumbo, underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, and just watch the river flow by, and you will have had a better gaming experience than anything you can do online.
Well, we are living in a simulation.
From your mouth to God's ears, though.
Yeah, but I realize that. But on the other hand, as a an aging public intellectual and also an aging hippie, if I can call out to the younger generation that anything you do outdoors, including like throwing pebbles at a bottle on a post, is like a way better video game than any video game ever invented. It has more pixels, it has more texture, it has better problems, it has better dopamine results. That sitting down across from someone and brewing up some coffee and drinking tea and having a face-to-face conversation is just way better than anything that can be done on a screen. Well, I realize that this is a little bit swimming upstream in the current culture, and I have two sons who are young men who just laugh at me when I say things like this, but I'm convinced that it's true. And also, I point to a historical example. In London, when telephones were first introduced into common around the turn of the century, say 1904, everybody spent 2 or 3 hours in the day talking on the telephone to somebody across town because it was so remarkable that they could do so, rather than crossing town or talking to somebody in the same room with them. I feel we're in that moment with the internet, and a time's going to come when a lot of people are going to unhook, unplug, kill their Facebook account and walk outdoors and go to the local park or go to the local coffee shop and sit there looking at somebody's actual living face and realizing they're having more fun, dope.
I think Will, as somebody who would never be described as extremely online, had a question.
Oh, no, I mean, this is going more back to the fun sex and drugs stuff, or perhaps maybe in something that you don't necessarily have to swim as hard upstream in our culture, particularly among young people. Another theme in your books, in addition to imagining a post-capitalist economy or society, you definitely also imagine a post-gender society. And I'm speaking specifically in 2312, the two main characters of the book, and the book kind of is a love story between them, are both sort of agender. I don't know quite, like the main character, Swan, they're capable of, I think, if I'm remembering this right, both male and female sexual reproduction, but you also talk about sort of post-nuclear family and different sort of ways of raising children that are outside of this current paradigm, which, again, I think more and more young people, like we learn more and more about this every day. And I was just, again, like, how is that process of that imaginative process work? Or, like, what are you drawing from and where do you see it?
Yeah, what's with all this cultural Marxism?
What's with all this?
Yeah,
let's fight gender.
It's really.
Don't you know the working class is socially reactionary? Come on.
Well, I don't know about that anymore. I'm not sure there's any working class anymore that isn't in China, and they've got their own problems. But for us, I'm basically reflecting San Francisco. That's the capital of California, and that is a very much of a gender fluid place, and I love it. I adore San Francisco. It's really the capital of my heart. I go down there. I'm a guy that lives in the provinces of San Francisco, and I drive down there. It takes about an hour and a half. I get there, and I'm having a blast, and then I come back to my boring little university town, and it's exceptionally boring, and San Francisco is exceptionally exciting. And I have friends there who've taught me all kinds of things, trans friends, gay friends, whatever, also just straight friends who are a part of that community. And one young person, and I can't even remember their gender gender identity, which could be anything, said to me once, well, it's all skin. Stan, it's all skin. And that was like a little switch turning on in my mind. This was when I was doing 2312. I thought, well, yeah, that's true. I mean, what's the big deal? And of course, there are the social roles. Of course, there's patriarchy, and there's all kinds of cultural determinants. But when you get down to bodies and individuals, well, it's all skin. So, as an aging straight male, this was like a mind boggler. But I did have one experience that was transformative. I brought up my two boys as the Mr. Mom figure, as the daily work of taking care of infants and toddlers, because my wife is a chemist. She worked, 12 hours a day. And from the very moment our first kid was 10 weeks old, I was the cultural role of mom, of a 1950s housewife, except, of course, I was writing these novels during nap time. Well, I spent a lot of time with women. It was women doing that work. And in fact, women still do all the work of social reproduction, taking care of infants and toddlers, teaching young people in schools, nursing the sick, and taking care of the dying. These are all 90% women's work occupations, and they're poorly paid when they're paid at all. Sometimes they're unpaid, and social reproduction is the real work that capitalism is a parasite on. So paying attention to all that stuff when I was hanging out, sometimes there would be groups of 20 moms or au pair young women and their kids, their infant toddlers, and me. And that is not a wonderful harem like, oh my God, I've got all these women around me. That's actually uncomfortable, and I knew I was screwing up the discourse in that room by being there type of experience. It was. You wrote
specifically about that in the Capital series, right? When you're talking about being in the gymboree or whatever it was.
Yes, that was very autobiographical.
Okay,
but yeah, in 2312, you described like a kind of creche model for child rearing and kind of sort of a communal family group. Where did the like sort of genesis for that idea come from?
Oh, there's a lot of it in the Mars books too.
Yeah.
That's right.
The idea,
zygote, the one of the secret bases.
Yeah. And like it reminds me of a lot of stuff I've read by Alexandra Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, and other Soviet era thinkers, because they were really wrestling with this idea because they knew, right, that one thing keeping us from having gender equality was the work of social reproduction, which was so much more often being done by women. But then there were people who kind of bent the stick too far in the other direction, who are like, well, parents are just incubators. They shouldn't have any contact with their kids at all. They're like too emotional to like handle such an important task. And that seems kind of unhuman to me too. And I feel like you kind of come down in the middle where like, you know what, maybe it should be a personal choice how much or how little involvement you have in the work of social reproduction or raising your kids, or like maybe there should be a balance between the familial biological bonds or whatever and the community.
Yeah, I would like that balance. I would go with what Jamie just said about a balance between, because you can go too far both ways. The 1950s nuclear household, suburban castle, 2 parents, 2 kids, is bad. It's bad for you. It's normed in America, but it's not historically normal. Usually you'd have a big old house with 3 or 4 generations kind of banging around in there. So there's the big house model, there's the village model, and there's the Paleolithic pack model, I called it, the mini tribe of 4 or 5 families and multiple generations. And then, of course, you still have your parents, biologically, and I am pretty confident that will persist, despite all the gender fluidity in terms of making babies. The bulk of them, when you don't have technological help involved, et cetera, it's going to be 1 man, 1 woman, a zygote, and on it comes to be a baby. So there's parents. And who knows what the gender identity of this man, woman, I've used them with quotes around them, but on the other hand, there's biology going on here. Then you got kids, but they could be brought up by a group with the acknowledgement of their parents and their parents basically getting help. That balance, I think, is the best way. Again, I was lucky when my wife and I moved out back to Davis, where we had met, and we had been in Washington, D.C., which was, as Greener shows, poor Charlie's experiences, nuclear isolation, going crazy with a kid, doing your best. And actually, it's a lovely bonding experience to be spending every day with an infant toddler. It's one of the most beautiful human experiences of all. You don't want to miss out on that. On the other hand, when we moved back to Davis, we moved into Village Homes, which is a kind of a hippie version of suburbia. It tried to imitate the English village model. My little front yard is a courtyard, but mainly there's no fences here. It's all agricultural, the landscaping. I've got my garden plot, and I've got a preschool center that I took my kids to, where they met all their friends, and then their parents became my friends. And so what that taught me was that design and urban design and what you might call civic design, it can shape social relations intensively, because I have lived a kind of English village life of the year 1600 simply because of the way they designed this particular utopian I'm in. And the best friends in my life are the parents of my kids' friends. And my kids and their friends aren't even friends anymore, but I'm totally friends with their parents still, because we still live here. So I've seen one version of the balance, and the creche model, I think, is a good name for it. You can't go too far the other way, because then you get to the boarding school model, it's actually a syndrome in British psychological pathology. You know, if you got sent away to a boarding school when you were 6 years old or 9 years old, like so many middle-class Brits did, you end up crazy.
Or like the British ruling class, where all their boarding schools, it's like
a lot of buggering.
You're ritually abused,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you learn that it teaches you to do it to other people. Like that's how you view other people, as just sadistically, basically.
Yes. And I have several friends, British friends, who went through this system, and they just shake their heads and say, that's definitely not the right way.
Right.
So what are you going to do except try to find the balance between us as social primates that have a really deep, I believe that culture, I believe in sociobiology. I'm just saying that sociobiology actually leads you to leftism. This is something I would suggest to all young leftists, that like you were saying, that cryptocurrency looks like a right-wing libertarian thing, and it sort of does when it's Bitcoin. And sociobiology was immediately tagged as being a right-wing, might makes right type.
E.O. Wilson, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wilson. Well,
I've heard a lot of people be very highly suspicious of anything to do with sociobiology just because it's been used for, really reactionary purposes in the past.
Yes, but I would say this, that they're mistaking it for social Darwinism, and it's not. That E.O. Wilson is great. I love him. And his student, Sarah Hrdy, wrote a book called Mother Nature that puts the feminist slant on social biology in a way that E.O. Wilson would thoroughly approve. The primates, since we are a primate, the primates that we're most closely related to, some of them are gangsters like chimps. Some of them are hippies like bonobos. There's no determinism. There's no biological determinism. All social biology is trying to do is say, well, let's see what we can learn from the fact that we are animals, no matter what our brains and our internet screens tell us.
Yeah, totally.
We're primates.
We
We're
contain
shortly off
multitudes.
the savannah. Yeah.
Sidebar. Sorry.
Well, I just want to continue to say that if you follow that lesson very far, it leads you to a good life. You begin to think, I got to spend more time outdoors. I should really walk a little bit every day. I should maybe try dancing, having a lot of sex, throwing rocks at things, altering my consciousness on a regular but controlled basis. All these things are Paleolithic and good for you.
Yeah, that is the mindset.
Swan, the main character in 2312, one of my favorite little conceits in that book is that there is even some question about whether she remains, or I should say they remain human, because as part of some ritual or just party, she ingests an hallucinogenic alien bacteria that continues to sort of multiply inside them as kind of the internal flora of their body.
Yeah.
I'd like to do
I was
that.
ahead of the curve. I was ahead of the curve on this gut microbiome and how much because in 2011 when I was writing this stuff, that wasn't quite as known as it is now. It's funny how quickly things have changed, and we may indeed find alien bacteria on Enceladus or on Europa. Now, eating it would be a bold move. That's all I can say. But Swan is a bold person.
Right. Well, I got to read that one. The scene in the end of Blue Mars, spoiler alert, when they all take Sax's memory pill treatment, really reminds me of descriptions I've heard of what it's like to trip on Ibogaine. Are you familiar with Ibogaine or Iboga?
I've only heard of it. I've never tried it, and I'm like too old to try new drugs. I have to confess to you. But when I was young, I'm really loving this rehabilitation of psychedelics, because for about 40 years I've just felt embarrassed at the stupidities of my youth, and now it's turning out that it wasn't so stupid after all, except that we didn't actually know what we were taking. But if we were taking what we thought we were taking, psychedelics are now being seen to be a very powerful and profound changer of consciousness, not just while you're tripping. And in fact, that's almost not the most important part, but afterwards somehow.
Absolutely.
The Michael Pollan book has been a revelation, and it's brought all that stuff back onto the table. And again, for people in their 20s or in their 30s who are still young and semi-immortal, who can stand the psychic shock of an event that big, I think it's good for you.
I've learned some important things, I got to say, about myself and the world from taking psychedelics, so I co-sign that.
Same.
Ibogaine was famously the drug that Hunter S. Thompson completely made up, that Democratic presidential candidate Ed Muskie was on and attributed to his bizarre behavior. But he made that out of whole cloth, but actually got that involved in this 1972 presidential election.
Oh, my God. Well, Thompson, wow. The road of excess leads to wisdom. He was a very excessive guy. I was never that excessive, I have to say. It was all, for me, rather mountain-oriented, a sort of a Sierra and surfing oriented. I was very much of a nature hippie, and
yeah, I'd very much recommend, if you're going to do them, combining psychedelics with the outdoors in some sort of calm, controlled way.
Are you saying you shouldn't take psychedelics and go see Hillary Clinton speak at a technocratic hell festival?
Jamie, you and I can do that, but I'm just saying, for
the kids at home.
Yeah, don't try this at home. This is a thing that we did to ourselves because we're 10th level trippers.
But you came out the other side.
Did you laugh? Did you end up a jelly of laughter on the floor? Because that would be the best trip.
I was laughing, but mainly it just underscored
laughing and crying.
It mainly underscored for me how fucking boring everything was.
How much you didn't want to be watching Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, didn't Matt compare it to one of those like hollow Tibetan bells, like perfect nothingness when we were hearing Tom Perez speak? Oh my God!
So stand on that.
Speaking of spirituality,
yeah, to continue on this, especially in the Mars books, in the Mars Trilogy, you riff on something that I think has kind of bedeviled the left or socialist or communist through the ages, or at least through the centuries, which is what is the role of spirituality? You know, if we are these primates, the spiritual experience seems to be something that's somewhat universal for folks, but yet there's been a lot of leftists who've taken a very hard line against religion. In the Mars book, Hiroko comes up with an entire religious system essentially based around Mars and the spread of life. So how do you envision for yourself, you know, spirituality fitting into some sort of post-capitalist society?
Good question. If I revert to a kind of a existentialist stance that the universe exists, humanity came to being by accident, there is no meaning to anything. So that if you take that as the base situation, then you have to make up your own meaning. It's a human creative act to make up meaning. And so religio from the Latin is to bind together. So the meaning comes from solidarity with other people and trying to reduce suffering. And so I get led towards Buddhism as a good binding together. But then there's also just this kind of cosmic consciousness of what is consciousness? What is this universe? A gigantic why kind of shouted in your face, with no obvious answer, but it is kind of amazing, miraculous, and mystical that we're here at all, having our thoughts. So it's a combination of those things that I think will never go away. The brain scientists are finding, the religious center of the brain is in the temporal lobe near the site of hypergraphia and epilepsy and babbling. It's kind of funny. The part of your brain that trips on that when you get these moments of cosmic consciousness or of solidarity with all people are one kind of thing, or all living creatures are one, which is this kind of biophilia or biosphere, consciousness of the biosphere being a single earthly body. It's quite beautiful, and if it strikes you as real enough to believe in or affirm, then that becomes the meaning. So that never goes away. And all the political work then is to clear the decks so that you don't have the unnatural suffering and the various human badnesses of greed and violence, that those get cleared away by an organization of society so that you can just feel better the deeper meanings, the cosmic meanings. So I think that's how it works, and I keep trying to write that out. The lessons to me from Gary Snyder are crucial, and my life in the Sierras, my life as a kind of a California hippie Buddhist, they mean a lot to me.
Well, I have to say that for the listeners out there who have never read a Kim Stanley Robinson book, now is the time to go to your nearest bookseller in person, not go on Amazon.com and order it from a screen, but actually walk down to a bookstore and interact with human beings and pick up one of Stan's excellent works.
It's really helpful, I think, in at least for me, I think for a lot of people who maybe are new to these kinds of ideas and maybe don't want to spend hours reading some dense theoretical text. I love science fiction because it's fun to read, the good stuff. It's very human, and it helps you think through these things and wrap your mind around them in a really cool and unique way that I don't think you can get from anything else.
I mean, for me, science fiction is great because it's sort of like ideology. It's a story we tell ourselves about the future, and the stories we tell about the future tells us, what we really believe and what we want for ourselves. And Stan, your works have been hugely influential on me, and along with many other great science fiction authors, or just fiction in general. I think it teaches us so much about politics and ourselves, really, and I can imagine living without it.
Well, thank you for that. I am a patriot of science fiction as a way of thinking, and it's kind of my hometown. It's a small community. It's scattered all over the earth, but when we gather all in one place, there's only just a few to several thousand of us, and I love that hometown. Although I think that everybody in that hometown would hope to also exist in the big city of the larger world. But yeah, science fiction is a beautiful way of a lens to put onto current life. It's especially for savvy political people, it's easily transcodable. So you read a science fiction text and you can tag the year it was written, you can tag the political angle of the writer. It's a kind of game that you can play that is not a very hard game because it's inevitable that the writer is going to reveal aspects of their personality, big aspects of their politics, and also the time that they're writing it in. You can't escape that just by pretending to be futuristic. You can make efforts to be mind-boggling by like I did in 2312, and that's a kind of a craft trick. But you can never really escape the moment that you're writing in. So I would agree with Jamie. The heavy texts, I read them. I try to strip mine them and read them as fast as I can. It's not that much fun. But when I read a novel, boy, I am immersed in some other reality. And I'm enjoying it even as I'm analyzing it. It's just like telepathy or time travel combined into one package. It's my favorite thing. In a way, literature is my religion. And then the reason I'm so involved in politics is that I think that political engagement makes better literature. So my ultimate allegiance is to literature itself as a meaning system. So I'm glad that you guys are reading it. I'm glad. I very much appreciate it. Sean, Jamie, Will, it's been a big pleasure. I hope you'll censor this so that I haven't completely blown my cover, but I actually feel like my complete works have blown my cover so completely. There's nothing I can say that will be shocking at this point.
All the cards are on the table.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure speaking with one of our literary heroes. So you're